Good evening and welcome to the second in our pre-Pesach series of Torat Rabbi Sacks, presented by the United Synagogue along with our friends and colleagues at Koren Publishers Jerusalem. Whereas our first session, when we looked at the number 5 in the Seder, was presented at Finchley Synagogue, Kinloss Synagogue in London, where Rabbi Sacks went to Cheder to after-school Hebrew classes as a child, this evening we're in Johnston Road, where Rabbi Sacks served as the rabbi from 1978 to 1983. Johnston Road is the Golders Green Synagogue, a beautiful synagogue, well over 100 years old. And Rabbi Sacks liked it here so much that even after he retired, he and Lady Elaine returned to the area and became congregants in the shul, beloved members of the community, where he enjoyed a very warm and close relationship with Lahavdil bin Chaim L'Chaim, Rabbi Dr. Harvey Belovsky, who is the current rabbi of the shul. So it's particularly poignant to be in this shul where Rabbi Sacks served as the rabbi, where he davened, but also where, as he told us in the study sessions he had for us, he tried out many of his ideas about the rabbinate. He said to us, some of them worked, some of them didn't. I'm telling you about both of them so that you can avoid any mistakes that I made, and also you might have some better ideas on how to do things. And that approach was typical of the way he wished to encourage and empower his rabbis. So it's very special to be able to share some words of Torah from him here in Johnston Road this evening, and our thanks to the Johnston Road management for allowing us to be here and to film this evening. Now our topic this evening builds on what we looked at last time. Last time we looked at whether the number 4 or the number 5 was more significant in the Seder. And we noted that Rabbi Sacks, when looking at one of those number 4s, that of the 4 sons, always felt somewhat uncomfortable about the Rasha, the evil son, the wicked son, especially since he was one of 4 sons, one of 4 brothers. So he didn't want any of his brothers or himself to be classified as the Rasha. And in the Haggadah, Rabbi Sacks has an essay called The Wicked Son. What does he say? So we're going to examine some of the sources behind this essay, and some of Rabbi Sacks' other thoughts on this topic. Just as a reminder, we will be looking back at some of his material from at least 40 years ago, as well as including his teaching to his rabbis around his dining room table in 2013 at his home at 85 Hamilton Terrace. So our story starts with Manish Tana, which is a guide which he and a number of other rabbis who collectively had a group called Yamin, that was an acronym of sorts for young ministers, but young rabbis serving in the United Synagogue, put together for Pesach. They all contributed to it, and Rabbi Sacks was the editor of it. And it's fascinating to see how the ideas appear in this publication. When you compare them to the beautiful Applebaum edition of the Haggadah published by Koren Publishers in Jerusalem, a most wonderful work to take you through the Seder and through Pesach. And as I mentioned, you'll find Rabbi Sacks' essay on the Rasha in that Haggadah. But in 1981, Rabbi Sacks, when analysing the 4 sons, wrote what, at least as far as I know, is his first role play for the 4 sons. We will see that role play became very important in his discussion of this particular part of the Haggadah. Just as a reminder, there are 4 sons presented in the Haggadah: the Chacham, the Rasha, the Tam, and the She'enu Yodeh Lish'ol. They are the brother who is wise, the brother who is wicked, the brother who is just very, very simple and doesn't seem to have any input, and the one who doesn't even know how to ask a question. Now, Rabbi Sacks, in his designation of the 4 sons, presentation of the 4 sons, writes, as I mentioned, a role play. And the Rasha, who we will focus on tonight, is called Roger. This is from 1981, 40 years ago. Roger is described as an up-and-coming advertising executive who will go far, probably, further than is polite. Drives a sports car, especially on Shabbat. His Jewish commitment is minimal, but he does not want to offend the family by not coming to the Seder. He is a bit of a Rasha. So there's Roger, this up-and-coming executive. He pushes the boundaries of politeness, but at least he comes to the Seder. He doesn't want to offend the family. And in this particular role play, Rabbi Sacks role plays all of the 4 sons and thinks about Roger in the modern setting as only coming to the Seder because he doesn't want to offend the family, but doesn't really believe in it. He saved for what, he says? Why did we have to hang around in the wilderness? This was many, many years ago. What's this got to do with me? Which, of course, links us back to what these four sons are, particularly the Rasha. And towards the end of this piece, Roger notes that he doesn't feel a connection with the Jewish people or the land of Israel, or even necessarily with God. Why should he be Jewish? We can see a modern portrayal of what we read in the Haggadah. And then finally, and this might make football fans amongst you smile, because we know that Rabbi Sacks was an Arsenal fan, but Roger says next year in Chelsea. So I don't know if that was a comment on Roger's football affiliations or not. But this is how Rabbi Sacks presents the Rasha in 1981. And in an article which continues this teaching, Rabbi Mordechai Berkovitz, who was the rabbi in the Kingston Synagogue in South London at the time, notes that the Rasha is someone who particularly sees a bad example. And if he sees parents who are not giving him, or other family members who are not giving him a good example, then he questions why he needs to go to such efforts to be Jewish. And we will see, again, this was edited by Rabbi Sacks, we will see the importance of this statement in Rabbi Sacks' thought. So once again, in 1981, Rabbi Sacks was already developing role plays for how to understand the Arba Abanim, and particularly the Rasha, which captured his imagination. Now, in 1989, as we looked at last time, Rabbi Sacks published Traditional Alternatives, which was his book on orthodoxy and the future of the Jewish people. It's from our work library, so I might say not to be taken away, but I'm in charge of the library, so I can take it away. And you can see it on screen now. So in this, as we looked at last time, Rabbi Sacks described a family of 5 children who were sitting around a Seder table in 1989. And the Rasha, in this instance, is represented by someone he describes as the rebel. Richard is just finishing university. His yarmulke, his couple, his kippah, sits uneasily on his unkempt hair. He is wearing it under protest to please his parents. He refused, though, to wear a suit at the table. His clothes, jeans, a t-shirt and a denim jacket, are a calculated act of aggression. So too is his peremptory reading of the Haggadah. His Hebrew, remembered from primary school and bar mitzvah, is still better than his father's. David and Miriam, his parents, never quite knew what to do with Richard. At 4, they knew he was going to be bright. And then Rabbi Sacks continues, I won't read the whole passage, but noting that at 18 he won a place at Oxford, and he has really turned his back on the Haggadah and on Judaism. He says, for instance, partly to provoke his parents, partly out of conviction, he has called the story of the Exodus paranoid and racist. Listen to this tiny people, he says, having the chutzpah to believe that the history of the universe revolves around it. Plagues strike, the sea divides, also that the Israelites can achieve their nationalistic goals. Wow, I mean, this is someone who is really taking himself away from our history and from our tradition. Part of Richard's anger, says Rabbi Sacks, is undoubtedly true to the fact that he knows that if he had grown up in the Soviet Union, then he certainly would have been labelled as a Jew, whether he wished to be a Jew or not. He was born a Jew. Why, he asks, does he have to take on the sufferings, the history, the hopes, the guilt, the inhibitions, the unbearable self-consciousness of this tormented people just because of an accident of birth? Now, this is a very uncomfortable portrayal, and perhaps we might be able to think about people who thought that way. Perhaps some of us watching might have thought that way, perhaps even still do. But this is the challenge that Rabbi Sacks was setting us, based in 1989. How does one speak to such a person at the Seder table? How does one acknowledge the fact that they've come along? How does one try and make them feel part of Judaism, part of the Jewish community, part of the adventure and the ongoing story of the Jewish people? And this was the challenge which Rabbi Sacks thought about in 1981, but also in 1989. Moving on to 1994 and Faith in the Future, which is this book, some of you may have it. A really fascinating and important work about what faith means and the messages of being a Jew in the modern age. And even though it was published in 1994, its messages resonate so clearly today. So Rabbi Sacks notes, and this is on page 141, in the chapter dealing with Pesach, he notes, why is this night different from all other nights? Those must have been the first words of Hebrew I ever said. If I strain my memory, I can still see my grandparents' dining room, with all the uncles and aunts and cousins gathered around on those Passover nights in Seven Sisters Road in North London many years ago. Pesach was the great family gathering, and all very daunting to me, the youngest, 3 or 4 years old. But I quickly learned it's in fact the youngest who has the best lines. The 4 questions with which the whole service begins. The answers, though, come much later in the evening. And Rabbi Sacks writes at length about the significance of the Seder and of the genius of Judaism for attracting the interest of a child. And he said, only slowly did I come to understand why. Freedom is not born overnight. It needs patience and training and carefully acquired skills. Of course, you can see this in his other writings in Covenant and Conversation and elsewhere. And he concludes this section by saying, no less importantly, the first lesson we teach our children is how to ask questions. Religious faith is not uncritical. It does not only ask us to take things on trust, it encourages us to look at the world and ask, why are things as they are? Could they be otherwise? The great prophets took nothing for granted, least of all the injustices of the world. They asked questions of God, deep and searching questions. And God asks questions of us. Why do we allow evil to prosper? Why are we passive in the face of suffering? For God and mankind are partners in the work of redemption, and every step on the way begins with a willingness to question why we are as we are. As I read the Bible, I sensed the link between Moses' 2 great passions for justice and for teaching children. What we learn as children shapes the society we make when we become adults. And so on Pesach, we turn to our children and say, here is the freedom God has given us. Take it and make it yours. Now, bearing all of this in mind, it is fascinating to consider how the Rasha, the wicked son, is portrayed in the Haggadah. And of course, Rabbi Sacks has made a very, very significant point, because the Rasha, and I'll use the translation by Jessica Sacks in the Haggadah, the wicked son, what does he say? What is this service to you? To you, he says, not to him. Hold on, I thought we just said that we encourage children to ask questions. Surely any question should be allowed. Surely no question should be off limits. But what's the response in the Haggadah to this question? When he sets himself apart from the community, he denies the very core of our beliefs. And you must set his teeth on edge and tell him, because of this, the Lord acted for me when I came out of Egypt. For me and not for him. Had he been there, he would not have been redeemed. Now this is very, very strong stuff. Set his teeth on edge, sometimes translated as blunt his teeth. It seems like a smack to the mouth. And saying to the child, you've asked this? If you'd been in Egypt, you wouldn't have been redeemed. Even more powerfully, the wicked son is quoting a pasuk in the Torah that talks about when your child will ask you, Maha avodah hazot lachem? What is this service you're doing? So if this is what the Torah tells us, why can it be that this is such a bad thing for the wicked child to do? It makes him wicked in the first place, and you have to hit him in the mouth, it seems. So in the Haggadah, you will see how Rabbi Sacks explains some of these points. What I'd like to do with you is to take you back to those shiurim, this one in 2013, at his home, and tell you how he taught these ideas to his rabbis, because he gave us some wonderful resonant ideas that I use at the Seder every year. Now, Rabbi Sacks, as we mentioned, said it's hard to view someone as a Rasha. But he says the response seems to be in reaction to a question, as we saw in the Haggadah. And this he amplifies by saying that responding in this way even seems to be, in some way, if you take it at face value, against what Judaism is trying to teach us. He contrasted this with Socrates, who was sentenced to death by the Athenians for teaching young people to ask. On the other hand, as we've seen from his writings, and as we know from our studies and life in Judaism, Judaism is full of questions. The lowest person, so to speak, is one who doesn't really want to ask, doesn't want to engage with questions, doesn't want to learn. We are a culture of questioning and of learning. This is one of the fundamentals of what we are as Jews. And Rabbi Sacks, as he often told, spoke of Isidore Rabi, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who said that his mother made him a scientist when, as a child, he came home from school and she said to him, "Isidore, did you ask a good question today? That's what I want to know." And it was that approach, it was that questioning that helped him become the incredible scientist that he was. So Rabbi Sacks said, we've got to work out what's really going on here. We can't take this at face value. Now, first of all, he noted that the presentation we have in the Haggadah of the four sons has developed over time. In our first session, we noted how important it was, in Rabbi Sacks' view, to study the Haggadah with the commentaries of Rabbi Menachem Kasher and of Daniel Goldschmidt, critical editions and encyclopedic editions which gave us access to different manuscripts and to the history of the Haggadah. But whereas the text that we have is the one in the Mechilta, the Halachic Midrash on Sefer Shemot, on the book of Exodus, we find it at the end of Parashat Bo. By contrast, the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, in Masechet Pesachim in the 10th chapter, presents the Rasha in a different way. Ben Rasha, first of all, he's called the son of the Rasha, Mahu Omer. He says, Maha Avodah Hazot Lachem, what is all this service for you? Maha Torach Hazeh She'atem Matrichim Aleinu B'chol Shana B'Shana. What is all this effort and bother that you are putting us through every year? Mikevan Shehotziet Atzmo Min HaKlal. Since he has taken himself out from the main part of the Jewish people by not wanting to be identified with us, Av ata emor lo, then even you say to him, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li. Because of this, all that went on in Egypt, God did for me. Li asa, God did it for me. Lo hotzo ha'esh lo asa. For you, though, didn't do it. And if you had been in Egypt, you wouldn't have been worthy of being redeemed. Now, this is also a fascinating text, but it's a different one to the one that we have in the Haggadah. So why was the one in the Mechilta, which we have in the Haggadah, why was that one persuasive? And that's what we're going to look at and suggest some ideas to answer that. Now, Rabbi Sacks set us 6 questions to think about when looking at the Rasha. And the final one is the one that we will look at tonight, and he felt was most important in trying to understand each of the other questions and this whole notion of the Rasha. So the first one is, can you imagine a child, whose parent rather, who says that his child is a Rasha, or says that her child is a Rasha? Terrible. What parent would want to say that about their child? That's just a very strange thing that any parent would say that with any equanimity whatsoever, or say it at all. The second is that the case of the Rasha seems to be in some way paralleled to a famous teaching in the Torah, in the parasha of Ki Teitzei, of the Ben Soreh or Moreh. This is in the book of Devarim, of the stubborn and rebellious son, who, in theory at least, could be liable to death for awful and terrible destructive behavior. But the Talmud says, in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Ayin Aleph, Amud Aleph, page 71a, that there never ever was a case of Ben Soreh Morer, and there never will be one. It's just there to teach us about what could happen if bad behavior goes unchecked, amongst other reasons. So, similarly, says Rabbi Sacks, as the Gemara quotes there would never be a parent that would reject a child so much to call them a Rasha or call them a Ben Soreh or Morer. And similarly, when you look at the Haggadah and the presentation of the Rasha, can you imagine a parent that would want their child to perish in Egypt, either according to our version, would not have been redeemed, or according to the version of the Yerushalmi, would not have been worthy of being redeemed? Every parent would have been trying to get their child out of Egypt along with them as fast as they could. So how can the Haggadah present this in such a way? Furthermore, said Rabbi Sacks, Is blunting a child's teeth, hitting them in the face, if that's what it literally means, is that what you do to a rebellious child if you really want to show them that what you do is correct, if you want to role model to them? Is that the way to answer their question? And he quoted the example of Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the land of Israel in modern times, who took up that position in 1921 until his passing in 1935. And Rav Kook was known, as he was commonly called, for, in his letters and his other writings, for showing an approach of tremendous love to other people, even if they were people who had somehow left the path of Judaism, or at least left the path of observant Judaism. And Rabbi Sacks noted one of Rav Kook's letters in particular that said if a son is tragically and heartbreakingly leaving the path of Judaism, a very, very difficult thing for a parent to deal with, Rav Kook suggested, love the child even more. Show them that Judaism is a religion of love, of community, of caring. Role model, in a sense, for them what they should do, and maybe that will be persuasive for them to make their own minds up to return to Judaism. It's the very opposite of blunting a child's teeth or hitting them in the mouth. That was the third question. The fourth question that Rabbi Sacks noted for us was thinking back to the story at the end of Sefer Bereshit, the book of Bereshit, in the parasha of Vayechi, about how Jacob rebuked some of his children at the end of his life in his last will and testament to them. Why not before, said Rabbi Sacks? He answered by quoting the Midrash that says that Jacob, one of our forefathers, was worried that if his rebuke went wrong, and it perhaps was not seen of coming out of a place of love, would cause his sons, those of them that he was rebuking, to leave him and go to the side of Esav, his brother, who of course was representing the antithesis of what Yaakov represented. So Yaakov's worry about getting this wrong meant it was only at the end of his life that he rebuked his children for behavior which he felt was inappropriate. And the Midrash and other sources as well say that he did it at this time to try and persuade them to do tshuva. And at this time of his life, this is an appropriate time to try and persuade people to repent, to rethink their ways, and to do tshuva. And that's why he waited until this particular time, even to rebuke his children for what they had done. The fifth question that Rabbi Sacks asked was, how old is this Rasha? This has a halachic implication, an implication in Jewish law. Because if the child was already bar mitzvah, or in the case of a kol, of course, bat mitzvah, then there's a big problem in hitting a child, particularly if you hit them in a way that might draw blood or blunt their teeth. Because the Gemara in Moed Katan, the Talmud on Moed Katan, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, page 17a, notes that if you strike a grown-up child, then you are transgressing the prohibition of lifnei iver lo titein michshol, of not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, which means that you should not, in addition to not literally doing it, you should make sure that you don't do things which cause another person to sin. You, in this case, provoke a child to lash out and hit their father or hit their mother, which is a terrible sin. And the Rambam Maimonides in his Laws of Mamrim, Hilchot Mamrim, chapter 6, halacha 8, brings this as the halacha, as Rabbi Sacks quotes it to us. So therefore, if a parent was to hit a child in a way that could provoke the child to hit the parent back, this is a sin. This is wrong. So how can the Haggadah even assume that we want to do this in any way? And then finally, Rabbi Sacks said, we have to zero in, as we've alluded to already, on the strange phrasing of af ata chakei shinaf, that you should hit him in the mouth and blunt his teeth. And that final question, as I hope you can see through the way we've built up to it, should inform us with everything else that we need to answer here. So in answering this question, Rabbi Sacks said he wanted to use drash rather than pshat. Pshat is understanding the straightforward meaning of the text. Drash, as in midrash, is where the rabbis took biblical texts and told us the religious meaning of what those texts are, what we should take from them as Jews in the way that we live our lives. And he quoted in particular, when analyzing this, the Haggadah of Rav Reuven Margoliot, who was one of the great Jewish scholars of the 20th century, particularly on historical matters and matters relating to the development of Jewish scholarship. And Rabbi Margoliot, going back to the Tanakh once again, as we must always do when finding the source of things, the Tanakh is the Hebrew Bible, identified, said Rabbi Sacks, two particular places in the Bible that we need to look at to try and understand what this phraseology means. Afata chakei et shinav, you should somehow break or blunt his teeth. And Rabbi Sacks said that this phrase, building on Rav Margoliot's work, is a reference to psukim in two of the major prophets. In Yirmiyahu, in Jeremiah, who was prophesying before the destruction of the first temple, and Yechezkel, to Ezekiel, who was prophesying after the destruction of the first temple. Let's look first of all at what Jeremiah says. And we will use the beautiful new edition of the Nevi'im, using the commentary and notes based on the work of the late Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha, another friend and colleague of Rabbi Sacks, who sadly also passed away in the last year. And first of all, we'll look at the reference in Yirmiyahu, in Jeremiah, which is in chapter 31, and we see it in verse 29. Yirmiyahu 28 and 29, excuse me. So it's Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 28 and 29. Now, what's the background to this particular chapter? What is it talking about? So Jeremiah is telling the people that even though the temple will be destroyed, and even though the northern tribes of the Jewish people have been exiled, there will be a period of tshuva, of return, as long as the people want this to happen and make it happen. They shouldn't despair. God will bring the people back to their land ultimately. And Jeremiah says, when describing this, and I'll read the English text, you can see the Hebrew text on the screen. But I'll read the English one because I think it will help us to start with. Rather, each man will die. 28. In those days, they will no longer say the popular proverb, the fathers ate unripe grapes, the children's teeth will be damaged. Now, you've heard the English, let's hear what the Hebrew says on this. Bayamim hahem, lo yomaru od avot achulu voser, v'shinei vanim tikhena. Whatever blunting was going on, or teeth being damaged through eating unripe grapes, it seems to be that whatever the children did was really the fault of the fathers. The fathers somehow ate unripe grapes, and the children suffered. So immediately we see, says Rabbi Sacks, that the context of this phrase is not just looking at the Rasha himself, but looking at where the Rasha comes from. What has happened before the Rasha comes on the scene? And then in verse 29, rather each man will die for his own iniquity. Each person who eats unripe grapes, his teeth will be damaged. And then says Rabbi Steinsaltz, quoting the commentaries of Rashi and Radak, the main commentators on the Tanakh, or certainly on the Nach, on this section, perhaps it is currently assumed that the exile must continue because of the sins of the fathers, but there will come a time where the children will think otherwise. Now this is chilling, because yes, it tells us that the sins of the fathers caused the exile. But if those sins had not been eradicated, the children may very well think, okay, well, we're in exile now, maybe that's it. What's our Judaism got to do with us? Now, let's look at Ezekiel. And here we are in chapter 18, which is a chapter dealing with some of the fundamental moral questions, the theological questions of Judaism. Sachar v'onesh, reward and punishment, tzaddik v'ralo, the righteous and bad things happen to him, God forbid, and what our responsibilities are. And at the beginning of this chapter, Ezekiel says as follows: the word of the Lord was with me, saying, what is it with you that you relate this parable, that would be the one of Yirmiyahu that we've just seen, concerning the territory of Israel, saying, fathers will eat unripe grapes, and the children's teeth will be damaged. In other words, as Rabbi Steinsaltz explains for us, why are children punished for the sins of their fathers? As again, listen to the Hebrew, you'll hear the familiar words. Vahidavar Adonai Elai lemor, ma lachem atem moshelim et hamashal hazeh al admat Yisrael lemor, avot yochlu voser v'shinei habanim tikhena. Same phrase as we saw in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah, and resonant with the Haggadah, that the teeth of the children will be damaged. And the context of this, as Rabbi Sacks taught us, and Rabbi Steinsaltz did as well, is that children are somehow being punished for the sins of their fathers. Now this puts an entirely different perspective on what the Rasha is doing and what the Rasha is asking, as if the authors of the Haggadah, when framing the question this way, as Chazal did in the Mechilta, are actually saying to us, hold on a minute, the Rasha doesn't come in a vacuum. The Rasha is somebody who actually is building on the sins of those who came before him. Think back to Rabbi Sacks' presentations, both in 1981 and in 1989, of what the Rasha could be. Someone who didn't really care for Judaism, perhaps didn't see strong examples of Judaism. That this can be disturbing and difficult stuff. But Rabbi Sacks said we have to hear it, we have to think about it. It has to make us think about the way we live our lives. That's what the Midrash wanted to do. And Rabbi Sacks says there was a time when Jews would use this phrase to think about what our responsibilities were for our children and how we had to role model for them. And maybe, as he put it, you have to repunctuate the text. Instead of condemning the child whose teeth are broken, instead look at yourself. Why did you give the child, so to speak, unripe grapes? Why did you not give them the heritage of Judaism? Maybe you ate sour grapes, and maybe that's why teeth are set on edge. Maybe they're your teeth, and maybe they have somehow become your children's teeth as well. You might see this child as a rebel, and of course that's the phrase Rabbi Sacks used to describe Richard in Traditional Alternatives in that 1989 essay. But what is he actually saying? Is he simply saying everything is a load of rubbish, so what is this Judaism to me? Or is he asking, what does Judaism mean to you, to the parents? I know what it means to me. I went to Cheder or Jewish school or whatever, but how seriously are you taking it? What should I learn from you and your attitude towards it? And Rabbi Sacks said to us very powerfully, a child can't live with mixed messages. A child might walk away to resolve ambivalence, God forbid. The Rasha is really saying, as Rav Kook also told us, that he loves his or her parents, but he wants to know what Judaism means to them, not just to him. Maybe their attitude in some way has helped set his teeth on edge. And maybe, leave a lo. That phrase of I would have been redeemed, but he wouldn't have been redeemed, is a cry for help, saying, I want to be redeemed as well. If my parents weren't so keen on me being involved in Judaism in some way, and now they wonder why I'm not involved in Judaism, what does that say? It's not a new idea, but it's one which is so powerful at the Seder, and one which we are reminded about it, Rabbi Sacks, by the Rasha. And in fact, in the Haggadah, Rabbi Sacks again notes. Let's go back to what the Rasha says. But avor asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mitzrayim. You say to him, because of this, God did for me when I came out of Egypt. Li v'lo lo. What, me, but not him? Hold on, who is me and him referring to? Could it also refer to the parents, so to speak, who has provided these unripe grapes? It's a very powerful, albeit disturbing thought, but one which we certainly need to think about at the Seder, said Rabbi Sacks. And he said that the end of this passage is a question mark, saying, are you really prepared to say if you weren't in Egypt you wouldn't have been redeemed? It's not a statement, it's not accusation, it's a question, because we cannot abandon another Jew, let alone one's own child. And this, I think, chimes very much what we've said in the first session about Rabbi Sacks' thoughts, based on the Lubavitcher Rebbe, about the fifth child, and what the fifth cup represents for the fifth child as well. You can never abandon another Jew, and we have a responsibility to promote a Judaism, as we mentioned last time, which is warm, which is vibrant, which helps people feel part of it, which helps people express their Judaism in the right way, in a spiritually nourishing and satisfying way, in a way which upholds Jewish law and tradition, but also it brings people together as much as possible. This is a cri de coeur from the Rasha. And Rabbi Sacks says this radical rereading says that to hand on Judaism, we need to own it first. That's how we should read the Rasha. And he said an inheritance is like inheriting a business. You need to make it your own, especially if you want to pass it on. And Torah is a Yerusha, the Hebrew word for inheritance. So, therefore, Rabbi Sacks says, we have a cri de coeur and a path to teshuvah for everybody. The Seder is reminding us each year that we are part of Jewish history. We are part of the people that were redeemed from Egypt, that received the Torah, that have been part of our covenantal community with God ever since. And Rabbi Sacks, in a very personal note, said that he learned from his father how to be proud of being Jewish, to walk tall with humility. And of course, he looked back in the Torah and saw that all of our great Jewish families and ancestors had to confront this question, whether it was Avraham and Sarah with Yitzchak and Yishmael, whether it was Yitzchak and Rivka with Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Rebekah with Isaac and Rebekah with Jacob and Esau, whether even Moshe Rabbeinu had to confront these particular questions. And Rabbi Sacks said that one of the main ambitions of his chief rabbinate was to help people feel proud of being Jewish, to make Jews feel proud to be Jews. That was one of the reasons he said that he wrote his credo articles in the Times and did Thought for the Day. It was a way of speaking to Jews who were not necessarily in the synagogue. And maybe if they heard the chief rabbi speaking on the radio or writing in the newspaper, they would have felt prouder to be Jewish, especially if the non-Jews liked what was being said. That was our interpretation of his words. He didn't say that part. But he said that he wanted these books as well in his writings to help everybody feel proud to be a Jew, because it's a privilege to be a Jew. One should feel proud of it. So let's summarize. We've seen how Rabbi Sacks was particularly intrigued by the Rasha. And when you read his essay in his Haggadah, you will see how he develops this idea throughout history. We've just scratched the surface and see how he presented some of the background of these ideas to his rabbis. We've seen how he presented it in 1981 with Roger the Rasha. We've seen how Richard the Rebel in 1989 was the next incarnation of how he would want to describe the Rasha. But we've also seen how in his 6 questions he turned the Rasha on its head and particularly focused on the idea of how can you possibly hit a child? How can you possibly hit a child to blunt their teeth when they're asking a question? Hit a child when they're asking a question goes against the grain of what Judaism is. We are about questions. And that search for meaning and that search for understanding Judaism as best we can. And of course, sometimes having to live with a question, difficult as that might be. But Rabbi Sacks, in this radical rereading, saw the Rasha as having a kritika, and saying to the parent, if you gave me unripe grapes, you didn't give me a pulsating Judaism, which I want to feel part of, I want to have the experiences of, I want to have the memories of, just as Rabbi Sacks had those very early memories from his Sedarim and the Seven Sisters Road as a young child. And the example which he got from his own parents, what is the Rasha going to do? The question is turned around to say, let's come back. Let's stop the child being a Rasha. Let's not give them any more unripe grapes. Let's make it a Judaism, something which is vibrant, and they are part of, and they will feel proud of being a Jew, as Rabbi Sacks always wanted to inspire us to do. So thank you once again for joining us this evening. Thank you to Aryeh Grossman at Koren for working on the production with us as well. And please join us for our 3rd and final session of Torat Rabbi Sacks, where we will continue to study Rabbi Sacks' early thoughts and his teachings to his rabbis. And may this be an aliyah lenishmato, something which causes his soul to have a spiritual uprising. And may we always continue to learn, be influenced by his powerful and wonderful teachings.